Paul, how's it going?
You.
Good. We're not live this time. We're just recording the show. So I got screwed up in the.
We're not live. Oh man.
No.
Why not?
I know. Just trying different stuff out, right? So.
If I say anything obnoxious, you can edit it out. But you
don't
bother.
I'm not editing it out. If it's annoying, it's annoying online forever.
Okay.
All right. So maybe not the sexiest subject on the at first glance, but definitely something I think a lot of people are underestimating, especially if they're in a, let's call it, more mature industry. And that's kind of tracking data. And I've been speaking with more and more. So the idea behind the show is I've been speaking with some clients, and I'm noticing, especially from sales, still some reticence sometimes in terms of getting your data tracked, like emails that you're sending, phone calls that you're making, meetings that you're booking. And the the pushback that I sometimes get is that, well, maybe for a junior team, but even then, like, why are you hiring people that you need to track all the time? Like, a salesperson knows how to close and all that. And I think there's this idea that if I'm being tracked is because I'm being supervised. But so one thing I would recommend people starting to look into and to reconsider and to challenge maybe their perceptions, if they're still hearing this, is that in the same way that marketing's been doing it for a long time, like, you can't improve sales results without data, right? And when you have a smaller team, fine, intuition goes a long way, right? And even on the marketing side, right? Like, if you have a podcast, you kind of know intuitively whether it's working or not. But the team scales, you need data, like which marketing emails are performing, which landing pages are converting. But sales needs to do the same thing, right? If you're not consistently tracking sales activities in terms of, like, how do you know when to start ditching a lead, when you start knowing that there's a problem in your sales process because things are stagnating between stage 1 and stage 2, or whichever stage. And I think this idea that you don't need to track sales because sales competencies kick in is maybe an older, I don't want to stereotype, but maybe an older mentality, not age mentality, but older thinking, where I think data tracking is incredibly important, especially now that we have tools that can track, like, the life cycle of a customer, right? From the day they became familiar with a brand to the day they sign or even, upsell and resell. So I kind of wanted to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you in principle.
Okay, nice.
Here's a surprise I want to throw at you, is that I firmly believe that if you track your data and you understand what you've done in the past and what results it's brought through, well, that's a great advantage, right? If let's talk sales for a second, and even marketing. Let's say if I know that in the past I did these activities, so much advertising, so much outbound, so much inbound, so much traditional advertising, whatever it might be. And from a sales perspective, I've done so many calls, so many presentations, so many meetings, so many demos. And from that, in the last 2 years, I got these results. I mean, that's incredibly valuable data to you as a salesperson or to you as a company. It's fantastic, right? And that is wonderful. But what happens is there's two things. People are lazy. Tracking requires you to be diligent about taking notes in your CRM. Tracking requires you to be diligent about understanding what you've done and putting it down, right? So that's one side. And what happens there is that a lot of people are not that organized in what they put in their CRM, right? So they'll follow the steps, but their note-taking is all over the place. There's no semantics to what they're doing. So they'll just basically have verbal diarrhea in the note-taking, and they say, oh, it takes more time. And what people are thinking, or the people I've spoken to, and even myself, is that, well, what I'm putting in there is nonsensical anyway, so why am I doing it? But if you get good at it and you practice at it and you keep tweaking things and you give yourself a certain semantic, what I mean by that is, okay, when you at this stage use specific words to indicate certain things, So a prospect should mean the same thing for you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
A suspect should mean the same thing, and a client should mean the same thing, and a recurring client should mean the same thing. And as silly as that sounds, it'll help you in being more specific in your note taking, and it'll help you in the quality of data you get at the back end. Now,
right. Oh, go for it.
So the other thing, and I want to hear your opinion on that, but what happens is that we're human beings and we're lazy.
Right, and I think that's why you know, in the whole scheme of this impromptu series of planning for 2022, you know, if your system
podcast,
if your system's requiring salespeople to log stuff manually, I think that's a massive red flag in 2022. Like, I think if that's the system, that if the system is forcing this behavior, that's definitely a time to change, because it's going to be and you're right, like, data is only as good as its meaning behind it, right? If you don't have your defined stages, if for me, prospect means one thing, and, you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and, you know, they have one part of the sales team where opportunity means one thing, and for him, opportunities means another thing. And so, you know, you need to have those common definitions, because otherwise, you're right, the data makes no sense, right? To say you have, you know, 20 opportunities a month means nothing if everybody has a different definition of opportunity. But just, you know, to go back on what you said at the beginning, is like, if your system is forcing your reps to do things manually, I think that's a massive red sign. I think it's going to definitely it's a prohibitor, right? It's impeding your growth, because, you, like you said, people are lazy. Some people are very CRM happy, others are not, and so on and so forth.
I have to interrupt you there, but you're a CRM expert, you're a HubSpot expert. There are, when you're taking notes in your CRM, when you're advancing in stages, I mean, your notes are also important, right?
Of course.
So what you say in your notes, I mean, you have to normalize that to a certain extent, because if you fill in your CRM and you're sort of wishy-washy in what really happened, that's why you need, you know, we've talked about this before, you have to have very specific milestones. So there's a lot of things to help you there, but even in your note taking, you need to have that semantic, right? And
that's why
establish that, even if you're alone.
And that's why, like, and we've talked about this, like you mentioned HubSpot, and we've talked about this to a potential client that we both have, you know, this idea of, like, adding playbooks so that reps can, like, fill in very specific information at very specific stages of your sales process. These are all things that help gather that consistent data, and like you said, ultimately helps the rep do better, right? If by entering consistent information automatically, whether it's email tracking or call tracking, and more manually if it's through playbooks and gathering consistent data, well, they can start knowing clearly this person is not qualified, right? Like last time we spoke about sales objections and how you get a lot of sales objections when you don't disqualify well enough or early enough. Well, you know, by having this consistent approach of data tracking, well, it helps a rep realize, like, at stage one, right, during the you know, even before the discovery call, that this is not a great fit, right? Because they know exactly which information to go look for.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your original point, it's not just, you know, because the word tracking sounds big brotherish to a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. You know, we've all read 1984, and so at one point the word tracking sort of gets a bad rap, but. And maybe that's the semantics that we need to establish here right now, is that tracking doesn't mean tracking to know what you're doing and be able to influence you. Tracking is so that you know what you're doing and that you know how to better your outcome. But
it's also to better the team, right? Because if you're like Paul's doing very little sales activities, but is crushing his quotas, and Fab's doing a lot of sales activity and not even close to crushing his quota, like, that as a sales leader helps you identify like some potential pain points. Is what's Paul doing? Does he actually have, this is all recurring business and maybe we're not tracking recurring business properly? Is it, you know, does his approach very good? And is that something we could...
Is Fab a junior who doesn't yet have good methodology? He's doing all the right actions. He has all the right habits. But, you know, Fab, you know, the first thing he says when he gets on the phone is insults the clients. But
it is what I do.
And you're right. But what I'm saying is that when you are tracking data, it's still nerve-wracking. I was a rep for a long time, and I remember when CRMs came in. Yes, I'm old. I remember when CRMs came in at first, people said, "Are you going to write?" You know, my idea at the time, you know, I liked my boss, and I said, "Oh, this is cool. People use it." But I also, in the back of my head, said, "Oh my God, you know, they want to know everything I do." And it's like they want to know my private notebook. So there was a shift there. There was a shift in the way people think. Shift in what sales used to be. You know, when I started in the early 90s, sales was, you know, bring in these numbers. There were no real CRMs yet then. So bringing in the numbers was still about activity, but all they could really track back then is like, you're on the road. I can't really see you knocking on the doors or making phone calls, because so it was all, and then slowly it shifted. And as the electronic era came in and you had CRMs, you could actually track what people were doing. Now, the good managers used it to help people achieve their motivation. The bad managers used it to slap people on the wrist. So there's still that connotation when you say, I'm tracking you. It's like people who say, oh my God, you know, oh, you're tracked, but you know, your phone tracks you everywhere you go.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I was going to say. And you alluded to the two things, right? Like tracking has this bad connotation, and then good managers versus bad managers. And to me, if in this day and age where you're right, your phone tracks you everywhere, your credit card sells your data left, right, and center about what you're buying where, and you're having doubts about tracking your sales activities, that demonstrates a fundamental trust issue, right? There's a certain trust issue within the company, whether that's coming from the leaders, whether it's the salespeople, whether, you know, like definitely worth investigating, because it's going to prevent your growth, right? Like if you want to scale and you have, let's say, you know, if you have two salespeople that are not entering their data or not tracking their data consistently, fine, you could get around it, right? You have like decent pipeline reviews and you should be okay. But as you get to like 5, 6, 10, 20, like that just becomes a mess, right? Yeah, like everything's happening left, right, and center.
And if you don't do it properly, it's going to hurt you. Let me, can I tell you a story?
Of course.
I'm going to tell you a story.
Back in my day.
Is if you, pardon me?
Back in my day, we used to do sales walking backwards barefoot in the snow.
I used to walk 5 miles to school uphill barefoot, and then 5 miles up home afterward. Okay. So what my first experience with a good manager, because I worked in it when I worked that first job, we actually did quite a bit of tracking. They wanted to know how many appointments you had, and they said you had to book, you know, so many appointments a week. And there was this whole thing of, there was this style of thought back then. They said we had to come in every morning at 8 in the morning, and we had an hour meeting every morning from 8 to 9. And then we went on the road from 9 to 5. And then we came back and we had a meeting from 5 to 6 every day. And they hired a lot of young people. I mean, I was young, you know, I was young and I was lazy, but I was pretty good at sales. I was a natural then. I wouldn't say that, you know, I didn't know what made me good, but I had a lot of natural instincts. I liked people and I believed in what we were selling. So that was wonderful. So the first boss I had was terrible. So she would say to me, and it's not because it was a guy or a girl, but she would say to me, you know, you have to come in. And my numbers were good, but she said, I don't like the way you sell, you know, this. And she was, listen, I was 23 and I think she was 24, and she, you know, she had 3 months of sales experience. She's actually a nice person, but she just didn't know what she was doing. So she was telling me, you got to change the way your pitch and everything. She was totally trying to, and I wasn't happy, and I almost left. And then luckily she got transferred and I had a new boss, and I was a little bit lazy. So I'd come in, I'd do the 8 to 9, and then I'd go on the road. I'd do all the cold calls I was supposed to do. And then I remember I'd go to my girlfriend's house for a couple of hours every lunch, because they said, you're only supposed to take an hour for lunch. I said, tell with that. I'm taking 2 to 3 hours for lunch. So we'd hang out together, you know, do what young people do. And then I'd go back on the road, but I always hit my numbers. But what I realized then is that I was more efficient in those 2-3 hours from you know, 9, when I was on the road from 9:30 to 11:30 than most of the others, because I knew I was going to take a bit more time. So when you're tracking people, you have to allow for the flexibility of the person's style. You have to understand what works for them. But also that second manager, he knew that. I hated getting up early back then. You know, I was 24. I used to get up like as late as possible. So after a while, I started missing those morning meetings, but my sales went up and it worked better for me. So tracking doesn't mean trying to fit everyone into the same spot. It's also understanding your people's motivation, what you're trying to achieve, and making the best of it for every individual, right? So that's important. So tracking is not about trying to whip you, or it's understanding the way you function and making that work best for you and getting the best result of the things that you control.
Yeah, and that's the type of tracking that you just mentioned before. That like doesn't. It's not about like, well, you have to start your day at 6 a.m. right? Like it's more a matter of like, you know, which elevator pitch is working better, which, you know, post meeting follow up works better, which, you know, cadence of calls and touch points works better for a prospect, and you know whether you know, and then as you realize maybe, okay, well, you know, when we tend to call people at, you know, 1:30 on Fridays, 1:30 Eastern on Fridays, that works well. People are coming back from lunch, they, you know, they haven't get, you know, so then you tell your reps, well, sorry, but this is one of your peak times. Like, you can schedule the rest of your day however you want, but you know, Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern, that's when the calls happen, or certain calls happen. You know, but that's the point. It's not a matter of telling like, Paul, you're, you know, and I mean, I wasn't in sales, but I worked at a company like that too.
But the negative part, the reason people don't want to track is because when they're working for, that's what they're worried about. They're worried they're going to be big brothered. You know, that's and big bothered.
Right.
They're worried, that's what people are concerned about from the sales perspective. And I'm sure from a marketing perspective, it's probably just laziness too. Like, we just do it. We know what we're doing. We're doing okay. Why would we track it? It's going to take even extra time. And to me, it's not going to bring better results if you keep doing the same things, you know?
Yeah, I think marketing is maybe different. I think their challenge is that, you know, because marketing has been tracking data since data has been trackable, right? Like since the web became more commercialized, because that's a lot how all the Google ads of this world position themselves. They're like, well, you know, you could track results compared to your, you know, billboard on Times Square. It's hard to track the results, but there you could track results. So I think the challenge that marketers have is that there's almost too much data and they're not really sure what to do with it, or they're micro optimizing, right? Like, my first email of my nurture sequence, you know, the click rate is 6%. Let's see how we can get it to, you know, 14 or 20% or 30%. But, you know, they kind of lose track of what that all means in the global.
Oh, so what you're saying is they're tracking so much, but they're not making good use of it.
They're having a hard time identifying. And I think, you know, we talked about this, I think, in the past, but I think, you know, marketers just need to have a better understanding of what their role is, right? I think, you know, sales always going to know what their role is. This is drive revenue, drive profit, depending on the maturity of the company. Marketers always have this, like, what are we really working for? Working for a number of leads, qualified leads. And so more and more marketing teams now I'm seeing kind of trying to optimize for revenue, like how much pipeline they bring in. And so it doesn't really matter the number of leads. I mean, it's an important metric, obviously, but it's not their end goal. And I think that's helping them see the broader pictures of what they're doing. So it's not necessarily about like, this open rate is not so good. It's more about all of our efforts together. What are we doing?
Let's say I'm a medium-sized company and I'm tracking all the data. What do you suggest a company that's not sure they're doing it properly does first, apart from calling you, of course? What are the first steps in ensuring that the data that we're tracking is being used properly? Because like you said, in marketing, and it makes sense to me, you know, and what you're saying is that they have all the data, but how are they really using it? So how do you best use it? Like, if, let's say you don't have this expertise, but you have all these tools that are calculating a bunch of stuff and you don't know where to focus on, what do you say to people? Like, how do they, what's the first thing that they should be looking at?
You know, on a very high level, if you can't answer the question, which levers do we need to pull to grow next year? I think that's a sign that you're either not tracking data, or you're not tracking it properly, or you just don't know what to do with it, right? Because do we have like a brand awareness problem? Do we have like a lead problem? Do we have a pipeline problem? Do we have a
Let's
pipeline
assume,
conversion problem?
Let's assume for a second everything's working fine. Okay, the company's just going. They have some leads coming in. Their brand seems to be okay. You know, like any other company, they get a few complaints here and there on Google reviews. And you know, they're a mid-sized company. They're fairly well known, but they have all this data, and they're saying, "Well, we would like to increase, but we don't know. We don't know what lever to pull because we're doing them all, and we don't really know what affects what." Like, what would you say to them? What would be?
Well, exactly the same thing, right? Like if you're doing everything okay, well, then which levers do you need to pull to do more of, right? Assuming you want to grow. So that's step one.
How do you figure that out is what I'm saying. They might say, yeah, I'd love to know which lever to pull, but I don't know which one because we're doing all these at the same time. And God, we don't know what's doing what.
Right. So then if you're tracking the right data and to your point earlier, you have the common definitions and a common process and everybody knows, you know, assuming you have all that in place, which is already a massive assumption. Most people don't have that. They just like, we're doing some marketing, we're doing some sales, everything seems to be running. If that's your answer, that everything seems to be working, but you don't really know what's working.
Yes.
I would, step one would be, let's take some time and map out that process from, and like the customer life cycle, right? Like, how are they buying? How are they making decisions? How do they become aware of a problem? What are you doing at that stage, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So once you have that approach, the same to like your sales process, but just expanded to the whole revenue process. So that would be step one, right? If things are working well, but you don't really know what's working, that's probably a sign that you just don't have any consistent approach to anything. And then once you have that, that's when you can start. Well, look, my, you know, let's say. Website visits to conversion rate seems low. We're only at, let's say, 1%, right? We're actually getting a lot of traffic, but nobody's really, quote unquote, converting on our site. Nobody's requesting demos and stuff like that. Well, that's maybe a lever that you can pull. But if at the same time I'm looking and like, look, we've mapped it out and my sales process is converting at like 90%. I think that's a little extreme, but let's say 70%, right? Well, that's on the surface maybe a very good thing, but it could also be a sign that your salespeople are only talking to the leads that are ready to buy, right? But you're missing out maybe on a pool of people that maybe need more nurturing, more hand-holding and stuff like that. So once you have that consistent approach, once you know where your conversion rates are from stage to stage, that's when you can start, well, if we improve our conversion rate at the top of our funnel by 1%, what does that mean down the line, assuming all the other conversion rates stay the same and so on and so forth?
Okay, so basically what you're really saying is if you have the data, sit down, analyze it, see what it means, and then decide which levers to pull. But there's an analysis that needs to be done to figure out what's there. But Fab, honestly, in this day and age, are there a lot of companies who don't have data? I mean, isn't it pretty rare?
I think you'd be surprised. One, two, so there's the bulk of people that don't have, and those are usually the people that have either no CRM or not particularly well implemented CRM, because there's no real, like, it was never really set up properly. So there's just no real data to go fetch, or their data is really siloed, right? Like the CRM is for sales and, you know, marketing does something over well. And then most companies now do have data, but it's still not usable. I would say that's usually the pain point that I see. There is still a percentage of people that are just not using CRMs, going still off of Excel spreadsheets and all that stuff. But then the people that are using, like, is your CRM encompassing like your whole revenue process? Like we've talked to, traditionally sales has been the revenue driver, right? Like but there's more happening, right? There's more happening at the beginning and there's more happening afterwards as well. And if all that data is kind of siloed.
Here's the semantics thing. I think it's still sales. It's just that now sales involves actions that don't necessarily involve, human beings talking to other human beings.
Well, it's still sales because they're the ones that are speaking to the customer at the end of the day and getting the signed contract and all that stuff. But it's a platitude really, but it's like, the world has changed, right? And all the data shows it, right? More people are coming to sales already informed, already having their decisions made. So if you're not taking that into account, well, that's mistaking a big part of what you could be doing to improve revenue. So maybe your sales team is top notch, right? They've worked with you, they have a top sales process, they have great salespeople and stuff like that. And that part is working very well. But if they're still ignoring what's going beforehand or after, if they have a recurring revenue and their customer service team isn't able to identify opportunities for upsells and cross sells and all that stuff, they're missing out on a big chunk of revenue.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, sure, the salespeople are the people that sign, but the world of like, you know, the salesperson is the only go-to person is no longer true. People are relying increasingly on online to, you know, instruct themselves and get an idea of what they want. And often you're going to see salespeople that are like, you know, they come to see me. Obviously, it's maybe self-fulfilling prophecy, but they come see me like, we want HubSpot. Like, they're not. I'm having less people now that are like, well, HubSpot versus Pipedrive. I don't. You know, it's like, because they've already made up their mind. They've already done all the research on their own, and we've said it before, right? The role of sales is to sell and not to educate, which wasn't necessarily the case a little while ago, right? When there was less information available online, you know, sales, depending on your industry, of course.
Some of my clients would dispute that still, because at one point, you know, if it's a very specific situation where there is a new way of doing something that is not necessarily documented, then there is eventually there's some education. But, you know, and again, you know, you're right. You shouldn't be educating right off the bat in sales. You need to find out first what the issues are. And then maybe after that, if you do have a solution that to your client didn't exist, then there's an education process for sure.
Yeah, but I guess what I would say is like, is there a more efficient way of educating, right? Like, does it have to be sales? And I mean, you're right. Like, some products are very complex engineering projects that, you know, I don't know if education is the right word, but have to have sales and sales engineers involved. And you know, maybe those clients are not necessarily looking on Google for, like, you know, how to build XYZ part to my own specs. Like, but they're looking for other stuff, right? They're learning differently.
I know we agree on this one. It's just, it's for the listeners to understand that, you know, what we're actually saying is that the prime job of a salesperson is to find out what the, you know, in your sales capacities, to find out what the challenges are, the needs, the wants, and then the motivation. And then afterwards, if there's a complex product, well, then how we get to there, you know, what Fab is saying is that there's a lot of different ways now through the client can inform himself before he gets there. But if it's a really specialized situation, then there's still a part, what I'm saying is that there's still a part of sales that will be involved in making the client aware. But again, it's splitting hairs. But yes, I agree.
Yeah, but I think it's like, if, you know, and maybe marketers are more aware of it, don't always necessarily know what to do about it, but are more aware of it, is that, you know, the B2C world has, you know, business to customer is definitely. I hope our
viewers know what B2C is.
Impacting the B2B world, right? If you look at Amazon and you make a purchase on Amazon, how easy and how continuously they're optimizing that ease of process. Well, people are increasingly expecting that in a B2B world, right? If I have to go to your website, request a demo, it takes you 3 days to get back to me, then you're forcing me to, like, sit through some boring demo. I just want to have 2-3 questions, like, do you do ABC? And you're like, well, let's evaluate your needs. I'm like, sure, but there's no needs to evaluate if you don't do ABC. You know, like, if you're making it complicated for people to buy and sell too, it's like, I think it's, and again, like, within the realm of your reality, right? There are some complex projects like we just talked about, and you need to go through that. But usually your buyer's a lot more educated when you have a complex product that you need to buy, like, or a customized product that you need to buy. But I think it's just, you know, going back to your initial question, which was like, when you have your process in place, you start looking like, whoa, like, why is it taking us? Why do we have such a big disconnect between the number of people that request to speak to sales and actually, like, you know, discovery stage opportunities, right? Why is there such a low conversion rate, right? And then that's when you can start looking at, well, what's the process looking like there? Well, sales are actually not getting those notifications. It's like marketing that gets those notifications, but we're a small team, so we only have a part-time marketer. So he only gets those on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So if something comes in on Tuesday morning, well, that is sales, you know what I mean? Like, and that's when you can start improving your process down the line.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So essentially, it's not just about tracking data, it's what you do with data. And we really talked about three things. So tracking data, what you do with data, and your state of mind, you know, particularly in the sales end with
right.
Like what do you think the data is being used for? And honestly, in this day and age, I don't have patience for someone who says, well, you know, big brother, well, you know, you want a job, you work for us, we're tracking the data, and we're going to use it to better help you succeed, but we also need it to help the company succeed. You want to be here, go work somewhere else.
Yeah. All right, Paul, we're clearly passionate, or at least I'm passionate about the subject. We've been talking for over 30 minutes. I think that's a great summary of what we talked about. I hope everybody does better for next year and has like maybe their eyes a bit more open as to what the potential could be. And we'll talk to each other soon.
All right. See you soon.
All right. Bye.